Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, hello and welcome everyone to our Visibility Authorizations and Locking webinar in FCS Express 7. My name is Rafael Gomez-Amaro. I am a technical application specialist at Denovo Software. If you are new to us and to FCS Express, our company is based in Southern California, just outside of downtown Los Angeles, and we've been providing flow and image cytometry data analysis and reporting software for over 20 years. Now, if you have any questions during our webinar today, please feel free to ask at any time by entering those questions into the questions panel, which is located in the GoToWebinar controls. Our staff will do our best to answer those questions promptly, either during the webinar or via direct reply from the questions panel. Today's webinar is going to be focused on the basics of visibility, authorizations, and locking settings for the different objects in your layout, and demonstrating how to create them. Before we dive into any examples today, I would first like to briefly explain each of the options on the page and provide some definitions and capabilities for each tool. Visibility allows us to determine which objects on the layout can be viewed. This is going to include the plots, pictures, shapes, text boxes, as well as markers and quadrants on the layout. And using the visibility settings, you can define if or when an object is visible. Authorizations define if or when general objects and plots may be selected or edited. And when an object is in select mode, you'll see a red border surrounding that object. And this allows you to move it around and resize it. When an object goes into edit mode, it'll have a green border, and you can change things like the gate position, the parameters on the axis, and so on and so forth. Also, with authorizations on any given plot, you can choose if the text boxes that are going to be associated with your gates, markers, and quadrants may be selected. Next, we have the locking features, and these allow us to set whether the different gate types in FCS Express can be moved or otherwise edited and changed. For gates, that means preventing changes to the size, shape, and position. For markers on our histograms, you can prevent changes to the bounds, the high and low bound. You can even lock those boundaries to specific values or set each bound according to a token. You can also define the position and length of those markers. For quadrants, you can prevent changes to the vertex positions so that your quadrants will not be movable. Now, all three of these settings, visibility, authorizations, and locking, utilize a common trio of settings. And these settings will determine when or if each action is allowed. Those settings are always or true, never or false, and custom. For visibility, if the object is set to always, that means that the object will always be seen on the layout. Conversely, if you choose never, that object will be hidden on the layout and cannot be seen unless you enable hidden objects to be viewed. For custom, you can create a conditional statement, basically using tokens and other kinds of formulas in FCS Express that's going to evaluate to true or false. If the statement evaluates to true, that object would be visible. If false, it would be hidden. And as you update the values the token is based on, maybe that's a percentage gated and you end up moving your gate, that token will be reevaluated in real time, and the visibility of the object will then be updated on your layout. Similar rules apply to both authorizations and locking, and we can use these three settings below here. Always is going to allow you to select or edit with authorizations, or move the gate marker or quadrant positions with locking. Never is going to prevent you from doing so at all times, and custom works in the same way that I outlined for visibility, where evaluating to true is always and false means never. Now, let's go ahead and get started for the day by looking at the first category here on this page, which is visibility. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up a layout here. And on this layout, we have several different plots up at the top. I have a density plot off to the left, two plots with quadrants looking at different populations, and down beneath I have a histogram and a table with some summary stats and some statistics down at the bottom. Now, for any of these objects, we can access the visibility options by just selecting an object. In this case, I'm just selecting my density plot to the right here. And I can go up to my Format tab, and I can select in the Object Options section the General button. And that's going to open up my live dockable formatting interface, which you can see off to the right. The general formatting category has several subcategories, name and visibility. For today's example, we're going to be focusing on the visibility subcategory. And here we can see our three different options: always visible, never visible, and custom. By default, we have always visible selected, but by clicking on these radio buttons here, we can change that option. So if I pick up never visible, you'll see that my plot has now disappeared. And we can do the same thing for the other objects here, like my statistics box down at the bottom. I can go ahead and select that. And then in the general category here in formatting, I can go to visibility and I can pick never visible. And now that statistic table becomes hidden. If we want to create a custom expression, say for all of the objects here on my layout, except maybe this first plot off to the left, I can do that. I can multiple select the objects that I would like to create that custom expression for. In this case, my table, histogram, and my plot with quadrants. And then from my visibility options in the general formatting category, I can choose the custom option. And from here, if we want to create a custom expression, what we're going to need to do is insert in a token into this field below. Inserting a token can be done by right-clicking inside that field and selecting Insert Token, or by coming over and clicking on this big T icon, T for token. Once I've selected to insert a token, we get this pop-up that appears. And this is going to show all the different kinds of tokens that we can use to create our custom expression. And we can really use any of these tokens alone or in combination to build that custom expression, as long as the end result is something that evaluates the true or false. For this example today, we're going to start by picking a statistic token. So I'll click on statistic and then insert. And here in our create statistic window, we're going to be prompted to select our data source. And we're going to be drawing a statistic from this plot off to the left here. So I'm going to go in my select plot section and I'm going to find that density plot. I happen to know it's number 2, and I'm going to go ahead and select that. And you can see a little preview that's matching up here, so I know I've picked the right plot. Next, we're going to pick a statistic here. And I'm going to go ahead and select my percentage of gated cells, and we're going to be focusing on the population within my red gate. And now when I click OK, I have my token that's been inserted into this field here. And on that token, what we're currently viewing is the description. So if we want to change that to see the actual numeric value of the token, or maybe just another description like the text or name of that token, we can right click on it and I can choose display text. And from there, I'm going to pick value. And what that's going to do is allow me to see the value of that token. In this case, it's the number 18.97. And that value represents the percentage of gated cells in our red gate, which we can see corresponds exactly to that number that I had selected on my density plot here. Of course, this token is reflecting the same number. Now for this expression here, we want all of these objects that we've selected to be visible here. In this example, I want them visible only if that red gate is greater than 10. So what I'm going to do is go into my field, and behind my token here, I'm going to type in a greater than symbol and then 10. So this statement, what's going to do is it's going to evaluate the true or false based off of the value of this token in front. And if at any time this value here falls below or equal to 10, that statement evaluates the false, and all of these plots are going to be hidden from my view. So if I come back to my plot with my red gate here, and I go ahead and start adjusting that, you can see that as I move it around, as that percentage updates and it goes and falls below 10, those objects on my plot will disappear. And of course, I can make them come back by making sure that that value meets or exceeds 10% for that gate. Now notice that only the objects that have that custom setting enabled have reappeared. These 3 plots. That initial plot that I had up at the top right and my statistic table remain hidden because they were set to never for the visibility setting. We can also set the visibility for our quadrants and the markers on our plots. So if I select my plot here with quadrants, I can go to my quadrants formatting category. And from here, we have a visibility section. And if I want to make those quadrants disappear, I can choose false and they will no longer be visible. And if I want to bring them back, of course, I can go and click on the true radio button, or I can right click on my plot and select show quadrants, and that will bring those right back onto my plot. Similarly, for my histograms at the bottom, I can go to my markers formatting category to format the visibility of my marker there. So I'll go ahead and select markers here, and we have a visibility subcategory within markers. And what I can do is I can select false to make that marker disappear, and setting it back to true makes the marker reappear. Now, these plots, these objects here, their visibility in general is set up for my red gate. Whereas in this example that I was just showing you, it's just the actual quadrants of markers that are going to be set visible. So if I go ahead and update this gate again one more time, you're going to see that those plots, even if I have my markers and quadrants visible, they're still going to disappear because we were setting those on the general object itself to be visible based off of that custom expression. So at this time, if I go ahead and move my plot over to the right here, we'll see that all of the objects on my layout are hidden. And this can happen whenever you're working with your data. But we can still view hidden objects on our layout, even if we have created custom expressions where it's just not possible for us to create those conditions for the visibility to evaluate to true. Or even if our objects simply can't be viewed because their visibility was set to never. We still are able to view and edit those objects, and that's using the hidden items feature. Now, this feature is located in the View tab under the Show section. And if I go ahead and click on Hidden Items here, you'll see that all of those items that were hidden are now back in view. So once that's activated, our hidden items are going to appear on our layout with this dashed outline here, so we know which items were hidden. Notice on my density plot to the left that we now have 4 new text boxes that have appeared. And that's completely normal. Even though these all say error, what these text boxes are really showing us is that, one, they're normally hidden from view and they only appear when we have in quadrants. So you can see in my plot to the right, I have a quadrant and then I have those 4 text boxes. So that's what these are. And without quadrants, there's no statistic to evaluate. So we just default to showing error. And also when you don't have quadrants, we typically hide these text boxes. So if you see them, don't worry about it. It's completely normal. But if I go ahead and uncheck the hidden items box, you'll see that they disappear back to their normal state without quadrants. They're normally hidden from your view. So before we move on, are there any questions about visibility or how and when to allow the objects to be visible on the layout? Okay, moving on, let's talk about authorizations and how we can enable or disable the selecting and editing of individual objects. So I'm going to go over to my authorizations page here. And on this page, we have a few different plots. I have a density plot, a histogram, and a plot with quadrants. And then below, I have my gate view right here. And if you're not familiar with the gate view, that's simply an object you can insert in from the Insert tab. And I also have a text box here that has a summary table with some statistics in it. Now, if you're not familiar with the different modes for working with objects in FCS Express, when you first click on an object, like my density plot here, notice that its borders appear green. And this indicates that that object is in edit mode. This means that I can do things like change my parameters, or I can go ahead and move my gates around, and that's edit mode. Now, if I click on my plot's borders again, what you're going to see is that that color has changed to red. And that means that the object has entered select mode. This allows me to resize my plot or reposition it anywhere on my layout that I see fit. And so I can go ahead and select it and resize and adjust it as needed. With authorizations, we can control both the select and edit modes. To do that, we need to pull up our authorizations formatting category, which you can see has been selected here on the right already. But if I needed to, I could go ahead and click that drop down and choose authorizations to find that. Now in the authorizations window, we can set which actions to modify, select or edit, and we can also in the allowed section determine whether or not they are allowed to be selected or edited using our 3 options here to the right. So in this example, what I'm going to show you first is modifying the select action. So I'm going to go ahead and choose select. We'll go ahead and do that in our action section. And then for my plot that I selected here, we're going to choose never allowed. Now when I go back to that plot, we can only access the edit mode. And you can see that because my plot's borders are now green. So with the edit mode, we can do things like move around my gates, or again, I can change the parameters that we're viewing. But when I try and click on the plot's borders, or I try and resize that plot, notice how I'm prevented from doing so. I'm prevented from accessing that select mode. So I can't move around or resize my plot. Changing this back to allowed is going to re-enable the select mode. So when I click on my borders, you'll see that that turns to red now, and I can resize or reposition this how I see fit. We can do the same thing for the edit mode. So from the authorizations category, I can go to edit. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and choose the never allowed, and you'll see that those borders have changed from green to red. And when I go and select my borders, of course I can move them around because we can select. But when I try and do any edit action, so I try and move my gate or I try and change my parameters, again, I'm prevented from doing so. That is no longer allowed. So I can only reposition or resize that object because only select mode has been enabled. And of course, I can easily change that by going back to always allowed. Now, rather than set up the authorizations one object at a time like I'm doing here, just like with the visibility example I showed you earlier, we can enable or disable the select and edit mode for all of our objects at once. And we can do that by simply multiple selecting everything on the page here, and then by going to the authorizations and choosing which actions to modify. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and choose the select, and I'm going to set that so that we're never allowed to select all of these objects. And you can see that that red border that appeared originally is gone from all these plots. And when I try and click on them, I can only access that green border, the edit mode. So I could do things like move my gate, but I can't resize or reposition any of these plots. Now, if at any time you found yourself locked out of specific authorization settings, or all of them in general, you can temporarily override those settings and access the objects in your layout to change or reset their settings. And this can be done using the Override Authorizations feature, which is located in the Format tab under the Override section. When I select the Override Authorizations button, we can now come back to our individual plots, and I can go ahead and click on the border. You'll see that it turns red now, and I can resize this or do whatever I need to on any one of these plots. So the Override Authorizations allows us to return our different plots and objects back to their original settings, and I can go ahead and pick any one of these, or I can pick all of them. And here I'm just going to return these back to always allowed. And now when I go and disable that override authorizations and I click on any one of these plots, I can access all the different modes here. So I've just returned them back to the settings that we had set previously. We also have some additional options for markers and quadrants that I'd like to talk about for selecting and editing. So to show you that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick my histogram here in the center, and I'm going to go to my gating tab and I'm going to draw in a marker. And we're just going to capture that positive population. Now with markers, they're just like our gates or our quadrants. I can move them around. I can resize them if I need to. I also get this nice text box that appears here showing me the percentage of events inside of this marker, along with the ability to edit the statistics that are showing inside of here. And if I select this text box, I can move it around. I can do the same thing with my quadrant text boxes. I can readjust those where I want, or I can grab a gate text box and I can adjust that so I can better see that on my plot. Now, if we wanted to lock a specific text box, say for the gate on my density plot here, and prevent it from being selected or moved or edited, we could do that. All we need to do is just select that text box. Then in the authorization settings, we can choose, in this case, select, and then never allowed. And you can see now that I am no longer able to do anything but edit the properties of this specific text box. I can't grab it and move it around like I'm trying to do here. We're prevented from using those select actions. And if I go ahead and reallow that, now I can reposition that gate one more time. So I get that red border appearing here. Now, we can do the same thing here for essentially any text box that contains information about our gates, markers, and quadrants that get drawn in when we add those objects. So if I click on my plot here with my histogram, and I'm going to multiple select also my plot with my quadrants, I can go into my formatting category, and I can choose the option selecting text boxes on plots. And what this selection does is this allows me to choose whether or not I'm allowed to select the text boxes in the markers, gates, and quadrants on the objects I've selected. And in this case, I'm going to uncheck this box to not allow that to happen. And now as I go back and click on my quadrant text boxes or my marker text boxes, I'm not able to select or edit those. So I've locked myself out of modifying those text boxes. So in general, authorizations are really just a great way to prevent unintended changes from happening to the objects and gates on your layout. So are there any questions related to authorizations or how and when to prevent the objects from being selected or edited in your layouts? All right, so I'm going to move on to the last section for the day, which is locking. And for the locking capability, what we can do is allow or not allow gates to be edited and changed. So by default, we can move around our gates and our quadrants freely. So I can go ahead and pick my pink gate here on my density plot, and I can adjust its position, and I can resize it as I see fit. And contrast that to the gate right above it. So I'm just going to select my orange gate here. Now, when I try and move this gate, I've already set this gate to be locked. And so what's going to happen here is that we get this pop-up indicating that that selected gate does not allow editing. Now, to lock any gate, like I've done for that orange gate here, all we need to do is edit that gate's properties. And that can be done from our gate view, which I've drawn off to the left here. And again, if you're not familiar with the gate view, that can be accessed from the Insert tab right here in the General section. And once you've drawn your gate view on, you can go ahead and edit the properties for any one of your gates. You just go ahead and select the gate you want to edit, and you can go ahead and double click on that gate. And that's going to open up this edit gate properties window. And from here, we have a few different sections that are worth looking at here. The allow gate edit section is going to determine whether or not I can move or select my gates and edit them. I also have another option here. This is a checkbox that is to require Alt plus click to select that gate. And this is one of these great features that's going to help prevent unintentional gate moves. So if I go ahead and check that box and click OK, now when I go and select my pink gate here, I'm no longer able to move that gate anymore. But if I hold down my Alt key and move it, I'm able to do so. So that's going to prevent me from accidentally just clicking and moving this gate. I can move my text box here, but every time I try and grab that without holding down Alt, I'm not able to do so. Moving back to my gate view, we can go ahead and modify the properties of our gates using another method. I just right click on that gate and I choose gate properties and I can edit it from there. And for my green gate that I selected here, it's already set to allow gate edit to false, meaning I can't actually move that green gate. It's set to be locked. So we're going to go ahead and re-enable the positioning of that gate. I'm going to set this to true. And when I click OK, now this green gate is going to be able to be selected and it's going to be able to be moved around and adjusted on my plots here. Now, all of these same properties for editing our gates can be accessed from the Gate Navigator as well. And that's going to be found under the View tab in the Navigator section. So I'll go ahead and open up that Gate Navigator. And from the Gate Navigator, I can do things like double click on a gate, and I can go ahead and select that Alt plus click to require the selected gate to be moved. Or I can do things like set whether or not a particular gate is allowed to be edited. So here I can change my green gate to be false, and now I can no longer move it without seeing that pop up. Or, I'm going to right click here and I'm going to re-enable the editing of my green gate. And so there, I'm able to adjust that freely. We have a few additional locking features with our markers and our quadrants that I want to talk about briefly. So first, with markers here, we can do things like lock the marker boundaries. We can also link them together. So we can do all of that from our markers formatting category. So if I select this plot here and I go to my formatting, I can choose markers. And from here, we can select our different markers and then choose the different marker options here, along with pick and choose whether or not we're allowed to move them. So here you see I have selections for my low and my high boundary, and right now they have values here, but I have these little check boxes, so I can lock my low boundary for marker M1 to be this position right here, 18,000, and that'll mean that I can't move that marker boundary. We also have the allow move, and I can choose whether or not to just in general allow that marker to be moved. Now for marker 1 here, you can see that I have a custom setting applied. And what this is basically saying here is with this custom expression, I'm saying that marker M1 can only be moved if this value for my marker here, the actual MFI, forfeit C, and that's what we have the value here, is greater than 10,000. And if I go ahead and move that marker below values that are going to be 10,000, I'm not going to be able to do so. So you see as I'm moving that M1, that's updating for me here. But as I move it further and further beyond, you'll see that once I get down to a value like 300, that pop-up message is going to show up indicating that that custom expression that I've evaluated, it's no longer true, and I'm going to be locked out of being able to move that gate. And so I'm going to go ahead and undo that there just so that we're able to freely move around that marker M1 here. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a closer look now at marker 2. And what I've done here is I've actually linked the high boundary of my marker 2 to the low boundary of marker 1. And you can see that here in my marker options. If you look at my high boundary, you can see that it is linked to some sort of statistic. It's also locked to that statistic. My low boundary for my marker 2 is also locked here to a specific value that I've just typed in. And what that means here is that if I go ahead and select my marker M2, I can move it up and down. But when I try and move it to the left or the right, because its high and low boundaries are locked, I'm not going to be able to do so. But if I select my marker M1 and I adjust its low bound, you can see that the high bound of that marker M2 is adjusting. So even though I have my marker 2 selected to have the allow move be true, because of the settings I have for my locking for those boundaries, I'm actually not able to freely move around M2 wherever I want in the plot. I can only move it up on the y-axis here because that position isn't actually locked. So moving on, we have some options with quadrants that I'd like to discuss here for locking, both in general and also specifically to quadrants. So on our plot with our quadrants here, if we open up our quadrants formatting category and we have a look, we have our quadrant options. We have things like being able to set the quadrant type here. In this case, we're set to standard. And what that means is that I have one central vertex that's available to be repositioned for my quadrants. And currently this quadrant's position has actually been locked. So if you look in the allow move section, I set that to false. So when I go and try and readjust my quadrant position, I'm going to get that pop up indicating that we've disabled our quadrant movement here. And if I want to re-enable that positioning of my quadrant, I'll just select this allow move to true. And now I can reposition this quadrant as I see fit. However, even if my quadrants are locked, it's important to note, so I'll go ahead and disallow the moving of that we can still format different aspects of the quadrants. So here, I'm gonna go ahead and change my quadrant type to floating. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the floating quadrants, this allows you to move all 5 vertices. They basically unlink them from each other. So I can go ahead and move the center vertex however I need, or any of the 4 other vertices that I have here. And basically, this allows you to set your quadrants with much more accuracy. But even though I've changed my new quadrant type, when I let go of that quadrant to reposition it, we're going to see that locked editing pop-up reappear. So with locking, we can still change the formatting features, but if we're actually locked out of moving, we actually just can't move the vertices. So again, these are very specific sort of capabilities. They're going to lock down movement, but not necessarily changes to the formatting. So with that, are there any questions about the different locking tools or features for gates, markers, and quadrants in FCS Express? All right. Well, with that last example, we've come to the end of our webinar for today. So hopefully what you've seen are some helpful examples for you to use as you set up these features on your own layouts. We've shown you visibility, where you have the ability to set up whether or not your general objects are visible, as well as your markers and quadrants. We have built-in flexibility with those settings, allowing you to define if or when those objects can be viewed using these settings for always visible, never visible, and custom. And we also have our custom statements that evaluate to true to prevent an object to be visible, and false to prohibit that object from being viewed. And we can always override those settings by using the hidden items command. Similarly, for authorizations, we can control when an object can be selected and how it can be selected or edited. And we use similar rules, again, always, never, and custom, to allow when objects are going to be uh, able to be edited. And we can override those settings by using the override authorizations command, so you always have the ability to edit and manipulate the objects on your layout. finally, with locking, we see that we can prevent unintended changes or erroneous changes to the size, shape, and position of really all of our gating tools, our gates, our quadrants, and our markers. And we have these three flexible settings down below to permit or prohibit the moving or editing of those gates. So in closing, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to our webinar today. And if you have any questions that weren't covered in our webinar, please feel free to stick around as we'll be answering those questions over the next few minutes, or you can reach out to us directly via email at support@denovosoftware.com or visit our website at www.denovosoftware.com to learn more about FCS Express. And with that, we're going to go ahead and open up the floor to questions. So thank you all, and you have a great rest of your day.